So yeah, my name is Amanda Castaneda. I'm one of the ARARA board members, and I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Julie Francis. Julie is one of the lucky ones. She's a retired archaeologist. She worked, I believe, her whole career, correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, at the Wyoming Department of Transportation. She's also adjunct faculty at the University of Wyoming. And really for the last 40 years, she's worked very hard in a lot of different places all across the state of Wyoming, focusing on indigenous rock imagery of the plains and of the mountains. That was in her spare time. She's also a really good dirt archaeologist. She's done a lot of excavations and surveys, and that's something you'll see here tonight, how she kind of really prides herself on marrying dirt archaeology and rock art archaeology as well. She still volunteers with Sacred Sites Research, Dr. Larry Lohendorf's nonprofit, which he is a co-author here tonight, and also the Wyoming State Historic Preservation Office. And I just want to say I met Julie in 2019 on the project that she's going to talk about here tonight. And she's just the most wonderful person you could ever hope to have on one of your crews or as a mentor, as she became to me. So it really is a great honor for me to introduce her tonight. So Julie, please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. And let's see if we can go into screen share here. Here we go. Where the heck did oh, here we go. All right. And Amanda, thank you so much for that kind and very flattering introduction. And thanks to Dave Kaiser for inviting me, and for Peter and Troy for all their technical stuff. And with that, I think we can take it away. And I guess thank you all for being on the call tonight. It's nice to see so many folks. But what we're going to talk about this evening, if I can get my act together here, is rock art on the Middle Fork of the Powder River of Wyoming, what is now known as the Wold Rock Art District, which is actually best known for these white painted stenciled hands, but there's a whole lot of other stuff there, as Amanda will certainly testify to. I'd also like to say that this whole project has been very much of a joint team effort with all these other authors there. We just got word that Plains Anthropologist has published the online version of this article, so you guys are getting the early treat. But where we are geographically is, and I want to move this down here. There we go. Is right here on the very southwestern margin of the Powder River Basin at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains. More specifically, if you'll notice this long red line right here, we're going to be talking about that area. And this will be a little bit different rock art talk, because we will talk about rock art, but we're also going to have to talk about the archaeology, alluvial terraces and rivers and dirt, and how it all relates to the rock art in the area. But that big red line that was on that Google Earth photo is known as the Red Wall, and it's this extremely imposing, very long hogback at the foot of the Bighorns. In places, it's 100 meters high. It's exposed of the Triassic and Permian red beds that you see kind of all over the Southwest. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, this was known as outlaw country. The hole-in-the-wall hideout reportedly used by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids just a little ways from here. There were range wars and stock detectives and murders. So it was a very colorful place back in the day. And I think it's probably a very colorful place, even probably for a good 10 to 12,000 years before that. But this wall forms a very formidable barrier between the Powder River Basin to the east and the Bighorn Mountains to the west. And there are almost no passageways through the red wall except for the middle fork of the Powder River, which you see right here, and Beaver Creek, its tributary, which you see right here. And where we're going to be talking about is this very little narrowest part of where the river cuts through the red wall. This has been, trails have been known from this area for a long, long time and documented. Indigenous trails running up and down the front of the Bighorn Mountains, over the mountains and into the Bighorn Basin, or down into the Wind River Basin in southwestern Wyoming. So this really is the link between the short grass plains of a more plains-oriented area versus the southwestern and western part of the state, which in many ways are much more Great Basin. But the best known cairn line is referred to as the Barcy Cairn Line, which is 48J0302. And it has been documented coming up the south side of the Middle Fork and turning south and heading down this way, that by the time you get down here, you're actually in the Wind River Basin. And it's marked by, it actually continues on down past the red wall and up into this area here. It's marked by cairns, stone cairns which you can see a lot of them when you go up the access road along the south side of the Middle Fork Canyon. Whether these were actual trail markers or not, I think is a good question. There are plenty of landmarks and plenty of ways to navigate without having to follow piles of stones. But they could simply be places where offerings of people along the way went. And down here, you see, we're looking back towards the mountains here. You see here, here, and here. That is, I believe, 48J0366, and these all link up somewhere along the line. There's good evidence that they've been in use for several thousand years. And there have been a lot of people of all different, probably linguistic and cultural affiliations that have traveled through this area. So more specifically, we're going to talk about, this is what was the formerly proposed Middle Fork Reservoir. And the area is actually quite well known archaeologically. It extends, it was originally proposed in the 1940s as for agricultural usage, with the dam site right here on Middle Fork, and then the headwaters coming back into that Red Wall Canyon. And it was first surveyed in 1949 by the Smithsonian Institution River Basin Surveys. So there's been, and this was actually probably one of the first systematic surveys for archaeological sites and cultural resources that was ever done in the state of Wyoming. The River Basin Surveys recorded 16 archaeological sites, starting with 48J02 to 17. 48J01 was a paleontological locality. And they recorded 3 rock art sites down here on the very backwaters of the reservoir, all on this, we'll call this the north side of the river for just, our purposes tonight, but J03, J04, and J06. Now, something to note here is that all these river basin sites occur on their map as little dots, and we'll see how that changes. But they recognized back in 1949 that there was a lot of potential to this area, and recommended that excavation be done. And I think they had a budget of $26,000 in one field season to do the excavation that they thought was needed at the time. So what that $26,000 translates into $2,025, I don't know, but it's going to be, it would be a lot more. But for whatever reasons, and I don't know why exactly, by about 1949 or 1950, plans for this reservoir were put on hold. It kind of drops out of the picture. And until the mid-1970s, when a young man by the name of John Jameson, who was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming at the time, was hired to go out and resurvey this area, then 35 years later. And he recorded a lot more archaeological sites out there. He also did some fairly detailed recording and tracing especially at 48J04, where he and Josie Kantner, who was working with him at the time, did some pretty detailed drawings on mylar and tracings of all these very fine and sized and some pecked imagery. And he ultimately did his master's thesis on this project. Mary Helen Hendry, who is kind of the godmother of rock art studies in Wyoming, visited the area in 1979 as in conjunction with Chuck Rear's Western Powder River Basin survey. The BLM did a little bit of survey around the reservoir in the early 1980s. And it was, for, again, reasons that are beyond me, it was once again put back on hold until 1984. And when the Office of the Wyoming State Archaeologist, who, Amanda, I did work for OWSA for like 15 years before I ever transferred over to WYDOT. So that's, which is all just well and good. But I was the project director on this, and you can see how all those little dots that the Smithsonian recorded turned it into a lot of really big blobs of much larger sites, more complex sites of a wide variety. We found lithic procurement or quarry sites up on the ridges above the reservoirs. There's surface scatters everywhere. There's stone circles on many of the higher terraces. There are the cairn lines we talked about, and of course the rock art. And one of the things I think that is very important to note is all of this is private land, and which in the world of cultural resource management, you don't often get a chance to look at. And a lot of this had not been previously hayed, which I think makes a huge difference in what we were able to find. But we were recording a lot of sites, and then the property owner here in the upper end of the reservoir over here was very good friends with John Albanese, who was kind of one of the, probably the original geoarchaeologist of Wyoming. And they had identified a buffalo jump very close to their ranch house. And so they asked if we could, in our spare time, and that site would be off this map way down over here, said, oh, can you come and record the buffalo jump and see what you can do with it? So we did some mapping, we did a little bit of test excavation, and that was our evening projects when we were through dealing with all of this. But we did have our hands full, and we didn't finish the survey. And so we suspected in '84 that we had a very complicated series of post-glacial, as they were originally called, or what we would refer to as the Holocene, the last 10 to 12,000 years of river terraces along the Middle Fork coming in here. And then this is Beaver Creek right here. And Beaver Creek is a much smaller drainage than the Middle Fork, and it has not been able to downcut. So it's trying to adjust its grade. And this is the only project area that I've ever worked in where we had our very own waterfall in the middle of the project area. And I always thought that was pretty darn cool. Not something you see every day out in the middle of Wyoming. But we suspected that there were a lot of buried cultural levels and sites in these various terraces, which you can see how the rivers meandered and changed and wandered around the valley in there. And so we had to go back in 1985 to finish the survey on the upper end, including the 3 rock art sites, which at that point in time, we did very minimal documentation of. We were a little bit more worried about these river terraces that you see here looking downriver, because they were all proposed as borrow areas to build the dam, and would have basically resulted in pretty much total destruction of whatever was out there. So we did concentrate our efforts in 1985 on just barely scratching the surface test excavation wise with backhoe trenches and also a whole lot of hand units. And this is one of the few areas I have ever worked in that you can just go look around and say, well, let's dig over here or let's dig over there, and you're going to start finding something. So if you look at this backhoe trench here, you see this dark charcoal stained layer right there. That's buried cultural level. Here probably is another feature, you know, maybe a fire pit of some sort above that. And one of the things that we were able to do is get radiocarbon samples. And back, of course, 40 years ago in 1984, that was conventional radiocarbon dating, not AMS anymore. But we were able to date many of these levels as well as be able to date the terrace deposits and how old each of these terraces was. And that those dates that we obtained from that work 40 years ago proved very important to what we ended up doing with the rock art in 40 years later. But for whatever reasons, and I don't think the archaeology was all part of it, but there was a lot more complex politics going on. Ultimately, the permit to build that reservoir was allowed to expire, whereupon I breathed a huge sigh of relief because it was like, oh my gosh, how could we possibly ever deal with this? It's too much. And so there was not much that happened until about the mid 2010s. Where the property owner was very interested in listing the buffalo jump that we had looked at in 1985, gotten a site number for, and drawn a preliminary map, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So the family started working with Mary Hopkins, who was the SHPO, and then she started working with Bob Kelly and Todd Sorval at UW to arrange for the archaeological field school to go up there. And amongst it, so this is looking at the Wold Buffalo Jump. There are drive lines that come, end up in kind of a V shape right at the edge of that drop off. Bison would have fallen over to their demise down in here, and that's actually quite a little drop. Those are house-sized boulders at the foot of the cliff. There is a bone bed down there. The field school was able to document a very late a very late pre-contact age for the Wold Buffalo Jump. And Spencer Pelton, who's one of our co-authors on this, he and several other authors wrote a wonderful paper that was published in 2019 in Plains Anthropologist based upon the field school's work. Also associated with, I think probably starting off with the field school was when she probably did her first data collection. Madeline Mackey, who was then a grad student at UW, did her master's thesis on the hand stencils at JO 3, 4, and 6. And what she did was she took very detailed, very accurate measurements to look at size and perhaps gender variation. And one of her conclusions was that there are adult and subadult sized hands there, which, that you start thinking about the group dynamics of all of that and of the people who made those. And that becomes very interesting as very, food for thought, let's put it that way. The field school also excavated 48J02, which is right down here. And that is now known as the Jameson site. And that's at probably kind of the eastern side of this huge butte called Castle Rock. And it documented close to 4,000 years of occupation at the Jameson site, and they never reached the bottom. So there's a lot more to go. So this continued, and then with the property owners are just happy with getting all these sites on their land listed on the National Register, which is really unusual in this day and age. And then in 2017, Larry Lohendorf started working on the idea with Mary Hopkins and the Wolds about doing a district nomination for those 3 sites with the hand stencils that you see here. So they began some detailed documentation in 2017. The hand stencils have acquired the largest amount of attention from the site. And for future reference, I want you to notice these initials down here at the bottom of this particular panel. Those are 1925. So, but remember that for future reference. However, as things always go on the Middle Fork of the Powder River, there's a lot more there than meets the eye. And first off, the family also knew of a fourth rock art site on the other side of the river, which is 48JO 4512, which had not been formally documented, which we did document that. There are no hand stencils over there. And there are hundreds, if maybe not more, what do you say, Amanda, of incised, scratched, abraded, pecked, and other painted images that all occur within these three sites. The hand stencils are basically just the tip of the iceberg. For reference, this is the largest, there's handprints in many archaeological sites, positive handprints. This is the largest concentration of negative handprints that we know about in the Northern Plains. And interestingly enough, the vast majority, there's over 70 now that Maddie documented pretty much all of them. Most of them are concentrated here in JO3, which is on the upstream end of the district, and most are concentrated and again and in JO6 down here at the lower end of the district. And then with I would say a smattering of stenciled hands and some other paintings scattered in JO4. But the district was listed on the register in 2021, and our very lovely Amanda was the senior author on that, and it's just an absolutely wonderful National Register nomination. And it is available from the Wyoming SHPO website if any of y'all ever want to go back and look at it after this talk. But remember what we talked about that distribution. So after we pondered a lot of this, we reached the conclusion that the hand stencils are all pretty much done at the same time. They're all made from the same pigment, which was likely using a local clay as the source. There were some like color variations when you started looking at these panels, and we had Eric Robinson out doing a little bit of PXRF, which didn't turn out as good as we would have liked, but chemically everything appeared identical between this one, which got lots of blobs, I guess you could call it, versus this one, which is much more finer. We came to the conclusion that the difference was probably in the consistency of the paint, with one batch of paint maybe being a little thicker, another being a little thinner. These were probably made by simply putting your arm up against the rock wall and either using a bone, a hollow bird bone, or a reed, something like that, to blow pigment onto the rock surface, or by spitting on it, which is an ethnographically documented way of getting paint on the wall. These are all identical, all made in the exact same way, very same motif. And we basically concluded that they were all the hand stencils were likely made within a very short period of time and are contemporaneous. And but they're also associated with a whole lot of other paintings, which is the first time you walk through there, you don't really notice that this is panel 10 at 48JO4. And you will see that the hand stencils, which you see a couple up here at the top, are associated with these rather amazing red and blue and green and tannish paintings. If you'll notice too that the paints and the figures are all interwoven on this panel, and that there's not exactly like, well, first they put the white paint and then they put the red. It's all intertwined and interwoven, which leads us to believe that this has a more mural-like quality, or is actually a composition done within a very short period of time. Notice we have a bear over here and a bear claw. That is, there are Native American indigenous tales about how bear lost its tail. The therianthrope here has bear claw feet and maybe bear's ears. So not just on this panel, but throughout the district, there's a very common theme of bears. And basically, pretty much, we had assumed, we had no idea, other than just a guess, that these were all probably relatively recent, a few hundred years old, in part because you can walk up to a whole bunch of them. Excuse me here. And this is 48J06. The stencil hands are on these walls right here. They are pretty much, at eye level, and then you can stand on a ledge and get right there. And so because you can walk up to them, and some of you have to do a couple other sites, you got to do a little bit of climbing. But as luck would have it, that panel of those spectacular paintings that we just looked at a couple of slides ago, the bottom of that panel is over 4 meters off the present ground surface. That is Mark Willis sitting there on a 15-foot scaffolding, which with John Laughlin spotting him. And I'm sure that that probably violates every OSHA regulation in the book about erecting scaffolding, but there are some boards that are supporting the legs down there. So it was actually pretty sturdy. And Mark used that, had to use that scaffolding to do the documentation, the high def photography, what have you. And all through this central portion of J04, from right around the corner of this cliff all the way down to here, there are paintings that are very, very faded, and some incising and a little bit of pecking, that are all stranded more than 4 meters above the ground surface. Now, this had our head scratching. Well, like, if they're the same age, and we really think they're the same age, how come some are so high and some are down at the ground level? And did people use ladders to execute those paintings? And or is there some other type of geological explanation for this? So Larry asked Bill Eckerly of Western Geoarch Research, who coincidentally, his first geoarchaeological and soils experience was in 1984 and 1985 on the Middle Fork Reservoir just downstream. So he was very familiar with the area. Asked him to come out and start taking a look at the river terraces. And that's Bill in the slide there for scale against the killer thistles that were growing out there at the time. And Bill focused on the dirt. He's looking at the cut banks. He's looking at digging a few holes. He's drawing some profiles and taking a much different approach while we were all trying to record the rock art. And as a quick primer in alluvial chronology and river terraces, I actually kind of consider them geniuses, given the time that they were working. Luna Leopold and John Miller in the 1950s, and this is pre-radiocarbon dating, set out to identify the sequence of post-glacial river terraces along major drainages, and they focused on the Powder River. And they identified a 3-terrace sequence. So you see one terrace right here, come down another level, another little terrace right there, and a third one right there, dropping down onto the modern day floodplain. And they guesstimated that this highest terrace, which they named the KC Terrace for lovely KC, Wyoming, to have a graded, meaning built up during the Middle Holocene. And their dates were a little off, but ultimately a lot of further research and radiocarbon dating of these terrace deposits in the Powder River Basin shows that that terrace started grading or building up by about 6,500 years ago and continued on to 1,600 years ago. So in other words, the river is meandering across the valley. It's flooding every spring, overtopping its banks, depositing nice sands and silts, alluvium, and gradually building up and building up and building up. And with the dating that we did in 1984 and 1985, Bill was able to go back and look at all those dates that we had done way back when, and was able to determine that by about 3,800 years ago, the terrace reached its high stand at about 6 to 8 meters above the river, which would be right about in here. Now, downstream from the district, that Casey Terrace is very, very prominent just around the corner from J06. You walk 100 meters downstream and there it is. It is also been found here along Buffalo Creek, along this tributary of the Middle Fork. Another terrace standing about 6 to 8 meters high. We don't have a date on that terrace, but he was guessing it was probably the equivalent 6 to 8 meter terrace or the KC terrace. And so we reasoned that, well, we have this terrace above the district, which is right there. We have the terrace below the district. We should have the terrace in the district. Except Bill couldn't find any evidence of the KC terrace on the surface within the district. So he did find present day surfaces that are about the same height, 6 to 8 meters above the river. But they turned out to be alluvial fans, which you see an alluvial fan, which is all deposition from the hills above the site and not coming from the river, spilling out on the side drainages into the valley. But they're fans, they're not the terrace. And so where was the KC terrace at this point in time? So Bill starts poking around downstream at 48J06, which here are our rock art panels here. And he starts looking at the cut banks of the river, because that was where we had the best exposures, the river cut bank. And he drew a profile from A to A prime of that section of the Middle Fork riverbank. And so we will be as if we are standing in the river and looking up that gully in this slide. And sure enough, he's able to document the presence of fine-grained alluvium, river sediments down at the bottom of the cut bank, which was overlain by very angular, gravelly boulder, stuff that had washed in from above. And at that point in time, we had no idea how old this alluvium was or is. And so Bill collected an OSL sample for OSL dating, which that's optically stimulated luminescence. And please don't ask me to explain it because I don't really understand it very well. But that date returned an age of a little over 4,000 years. Well, with a pretty good plus or minus factor in there, which that is exactly within the age that the KC terrace was aggrading. So we were pretty certain at this point in time that yes, we had the KC terrace preserved just at the mouth of that side canyon below J06. We then got Spencer Pelton, which this is Spencer here, and that's Madeline Mackey, and these were field school students, I think from probably 2013. But in 2020, we got Spencer to volunteer to go into this little arroyo and profile that head wall of that cut bank. Again, something in probably violation of every OSHA regulation on the face of the planet. He's got 2 meters of loose dirt above his head, and but it all worked. And when Spencer started profiling, again, he found that same fine-grained alluvium down here, and then saw in the cut bank or at the side of the arroyo that he didn't actually profile, where it had actually been cut out and eroded away. And then subsequently, the gully gets filled with all this rocky, angular, gravelly stuff coming in from upland soils. Of equal importance is that there was a very weakly developed soil horizon at the top of this cut, which is not high enough to actually have been the high stand. And that returned a date of about 380, say roughly 400 years ago. So all this dirt, which is close to 2 meters of dirt, accumulated, has to be younger than the date of this cut. So therefore, that's accumulated in the last 400 years, which is a lot of dirt washing downhill. And so you know, we were pretty certain that that indeed was the Casey Terrace, as the OSL date later presumed. We thought pretty much at that point in time that the Casey Terrace had been the surface from which those stranded paintings were made. And what had to happen after that was in 2023, Spencer and his wife Hallie and I went back out with a total station and measured the elevations of those stranded panels above the current riverbank or the current river level, and also at JO4 or JO6 and JO 4512. And guess what? And we kind of estimated this using Google Earth, but a total station's a whole lot better. They're all a minimum of almost 7 meters above the current riverbank, and which that terrace has been eroded out. And there used to be a terrace there, and you could have walked right along there. So we did this little reconstruction, Spencer did, that here we have this Casey Terrace, a grading between 6,500 to 3,800 years ago. It stabilizes at about 3,800 and provides the surface at which the hand stencils and the paintings at JO4 and probably some of the engravings were done. Over here on the other side of the river, there would have been rockfall and foot slope deposits from which the panel that you will see a little bit later is actually 15 meters above the river, could have been used to access that. So then today, then after 1,600 years ago, the river starts downcutting and incising and eroding the terrace. It's meandering back and forth and taking out chunks of that terrace here and chunks of that terrace here. And we're estimating that the terrace had been pretty much completely removed within the district by around 450 years ago. And this, of course, strands those figures. They're in the air now. And let's see, there we go. And so they're 4 meters high. Then there's a short period of aggradation with what's called the lightning terrace. And then after about 400 years ago, based upon that radiocarbon date from JO6, all of this, we get all this upland deposition happening in the last 450 years, which actually restores access to some of the panels. And how does this translate into the sites, which, this is all kind of theoretical with a lot of nice profiles that archaeologists really just love to look at. This is JO3 on the upstream end. At 8 meters above the river, the Casey Terrace would have been right about here. So for your imagination, or use your imagination and just, put all that nice green grass and the river flowing right here at the base of that big boulder. The stenciled hands that we're looking at up there are actually right up in there at the top of this little niche. And they would have been, we figure there would have been some rockfall, not what we are looking at here, but some rockfall that people could have climbed up, probably gotten on that ledge, and then placed those stenciled hands on the back wall of that little shelter and cave. So then, after 1,600 years ago, that terrace erodes. It destabilizes that slope. And this big rockfall comes down. And it's the panel 3, those stenciled hands are now stranded. And then on this panel, what is now panel 1, probably sometime after about 400 years ago, 450, these shield-bearing warriors are painted right here, along there. And they're very faded now. They would have been spectacular based upon the analysis that I think Yanni and Larry and Amanda and Charles did. Some of these appear to be what Jim Kaiser and Dave Kaiser, I believe, or no, George Pochat described as the Timber Creek style, likely affiliated with the Crow. A couple of others of these shields are somewhat similar to Castle Garden style shields, which by virtue of the abrading, which Larry and quite a few other people now are suggested associating with the Kiowa, these ages have been suggested for Timber Creek and possibly Castle Garden as well, which is about the same time that the Crow and the Kiowa were aligned. And so they were placed on this wall after that rockfall happened, and you could get there. Panel 5 is a little finely incised elk, and it would have had to have been placed after that boulder went down. It's kind of a scratched elk. He's really hard to find. And then panel 3 is still yet isolated. 2, 6, and 4 are all Euro-American graffiti. And with those 1925 dates that were on panel 3, I'm thinking there was an additional rockfall in here, which means you can actually get to panel 3 sort of here. The other thing I want you to know is notice on here is all the bear heraldry. Let me go back real quick. Got too excited. Bear heraldry on these shields. And if you'll notice here, here's a figure riding a bear. We're going to see that again. So yes, you can get up to about where somebody could have stood to incise those 1920s initials, but you have to be a lot younger than me, a lot nimbler, and a lot braver. And that's Devin Oldman, who was then the Northern Arapaho Tipo, who was brave enough in my book to actually get up there. And he's covering up that part of the panel that has those 1920s initials on it. But that's the only place where there's a new addition onto those panels, which makes me think that, you know, the place is still kind of unstable. And that's Mary Hopkins trying to take a picture down there. So going to J04. At 3,800, okay, 3,800 years ago, these rock falls were not there. And the river was running, and I'm going to suggest very close to the cliff bank, right about in here. And up here on the upstream end of the site, tucked up back in here, there's this little shelter. And sure enough, on the roof of this shelter are 2 hand stencils, which we think were probably the first things that were put onto the rock there. Right below on this wall of the shelter are these pecked figures and incised figures. Note here these crosses, and which we will see again. And we think that these were probably what I'm going to refer to as pre-bow and arrow, which would be about 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, but slightly older than bow and arrow, as is the case with the handprints, or what we are typically archaeologists refer to as the Archaic period. Notice there's rock art all on this perpendicular face right here. So notice this figure here, which for all the world resembles an atlatl or a spear thrower, which was the predominant technology pre-bow and arrow. There's also a similar atlatl figure at J03. There was a horizontal hand stencil that could well be an atlatl. And then notice this spectacular bear claw with the lizard in it. And also notice that we need to study the superimpositions here a lot better, because I think some of the fine scratches are probably older than the more deeply incised bear claw. But then some of this could have been added after that big rock fall came down, but I think predominantly we're looking at archaic or pre bow and arrow imagery. You come down the river and down the hill, and yes, it is steep, so you can see some very small human beings for scale on this rock fall. All along this very smooth face, which goes around the corner and comes down here, again stranded. That spectacular painted panel is right there. And there are very faint paintings and incisings and a little bit of pecking all along that huge expanse of sandstone, which includes green paint, red paint, white paint. There's probably some blue paint that we couldn't actually see. Here's some of the white painted geometry, and that's a really old slide, and we may not be able to see that anymore. Eric here is trying to do some PRXF on the what I referred to as the incredible disappearing green paint, but also in the same area, note these are all incised figures with these vertical H's and plus signs, what has been referred to as vertical vertical series tradition, which Jim Kaiser, I believe, has suggested that's possibly of archaic age. And based upon his positioning above that undercut, I would tend to agree with him. And also look at this. For all the world, it looks an awful lot like an atlatl or a spear thrower. So our thinking is that the vast majority of imagery that you can't see very well anymore above in this central portion of the site could well be quite old. And then getting down to the spectacular panel 10. This is a photo I took in 1984. That's a scanned slide. It was actually, I actually took that with film, which who's ever heard of film anymore? And the panels fared fairly well over 40 years, but it is fading. And this is one of Mark's high def photos. But I thought my old slide, especially that's a scan, came out pretty darn good with my Pentax K1000 camera that I just still yet love. But notice here on this is that there's scratching down at the very bottom of this panel and only at the very bottom. And so that could have been added after all the paintings and when the cliff face was still somewhat accessible. Moving a little farther down, I threw in this completely unaltered slide to show how faded some of this stuff is now. You can barely see some red splotches. When you actually get up close and look at it, those are those red splotches there with white paint, shield-bearing warrior, some kind of birds maybe, or animals, other lines. It appears that, and then these incised figures here, maybe those are lodges, but remember this bird. We're going to talk about that bird a little bit more. Right in here, it appears that the white is over the red and the scratching is over everything else. So, you know, portions of this could have been accessible much later in time after the paintings were on there. And coming down towards the downstream into the site, we have this absolutely amazing bear that's only, which is right here on panel 13, which is only visible when the sun is just right. And all of a sudden the bear just appears out of the rock. And Amanda and Charles found it. And it's totally amazing. And it's got little incised teeth and eyes drilled out for holes. And it's, you know, the bear is coming out of the rock. And just down the corner from there, we have another panel of hand stencils, panel 14 here, kind of in the bottom half, and then with these paintings added to them. And notice the scratching, which is indeed superimposed over the paint on this particular panel, is again only on the lower half of the panel. And then on this perpendicular wall, we have these very finely incised teepees, which are barely visible in this day and age. So after 1600 years ago, the terrace gets removed. All of this in the middle of the site, you know, from up here all the way down, gets stranded. There's no rock art below it. You know, probably for a variety of reasons, the rock is not really of high quality. And even if there had been something below that overhang, oops, excuse me again, it would have been destroyed by river erosion after 400 years ago, thereabouts. everything starts washing downhill and downslope and starts restoring access to some of these slides. So here to these panels. So here we have panel 10, which is protected by, there's pretty good overhang there, and there's not a modern rockfall in front of it, as opposed to the contemporaneous panel 13, which you can access from the present ground surface from this very recent rockfall. And same thing at J06. The KC Terrace probably would have been very close to the current ground level, which is now all gravel and alluvial fan and slope wash debris, which filled in after about 400 and some odd years ago. And what gets added to these panels then? But here we have a camp circle. Here we have what may be either Spring Boy or Lodge Boy, which are one of the Crow twin heroes, one of whom is kidnapped by this ogre that lives in the sky named Long Arm. And Long Arm is going to do bad things to one of the twins. And the twin is rescued by his twin, who lops off the hand of Long Arm. So here we have this very distinctive type of image, which Larry really has tied to Spring Boy and Lodge Boy, with his feather, the bug eyes, the round ears, and the long arm right above him. And so these, we think, are all very clearly crow scenes. Sorry about that. That were added probably after about 400 years ago to the panel with the stenciled hands. And going to our last site, JO 4512. This surface here, there are 7 panels there, almost all of which you can look at and easily access from the top of this talus slope right here. And except for panel 4 up there on that little splotch of varnish. And one day, as we were packing up to go back to camp, Charles looks up and says, "Holy cow, what the heck is up there?" And this is what he was seeing. Some of the most unusual anthropomorphic figures I think Larry has seen, I have seen. It's like, what the heck? With these weird ears. This is an incised figure. Note the bird that looks like it's about to take a chunk out of this guy's head if he hasn't already taken a chunk. The very strange ears, the breastplate, the elongated claw-like fingers. Also notice here too, and you can only see the top one, there's 3 or 4 little vertical crosses right next to him. And that panel is up here. So it's still yet stranded and would have had to have been accessed from foot slope deposits on top of the KC Terrace. Again, we think this is quite old, definitely pre-bow and arrow, sometime in the Archaic. We have this other figure here that's abraded, again, with very unusual ears, possibly holding a spear of some sort. And then it appears that there's kind of an animal figure that's been abraded. But for all the world, these little crosses look just like that vertical series art over on the other side of the river. And again, lending credence to the argument that these are quite old, pre-bow and arrow. I don't want to say that they're 3,800 years old, but they couldn't be any older than that. But certainly, they're not recent. And if anybody's ever seen anything like this in any place, Larry and I and Amanda and Charles would love to know. So, but then when you walk along the top of that talus slope, which is a big rock fall, you get this beautiful kind of abraded image of a bear. And then when you actually get up close, you have the bear rider spearing the bear, which, as Aaron Bryn told us, amongst the crazy things that young crow men like to do to try to get power of the bear. All of these scenes were added after that last rock fall, which is at about 9 meters above the river right now. So it's higher than the KC Terrace would have been. And with added this crow imagery. And here You can see actually in this slide, this vertically oriented bear, which here is the drawing of him. And again, thanks to Aaron, who pointed out the bear song dance, which is done by crowmen with the bears in the tree, standing vertically right over here. Where's my cursor? There it is. People dancing, singing, seeking the power of the bear, because the bear was very venerated by the crow, and people wanted to be like the bear for their qualities of fierceness and bravery and loyalty. And so this was part of that. And all of these scenes, there is over here on this side of the river, there is one very finely incised horse, which is our only evidence of any post-contact age imagery in here. So the point being, or one of the points being, is that this is an incredibly active landscape. This is an active slump block above panels 13, 14, and 15. Stuff still, every time it rains, stuff still comes down off of this and is building up that little cone right there. Here at the top end of J04, there's been enough stuff come washing over the edge of the cliff that it's still yet accumulating and building, and again, starting to bury the images. You know, it'll be interesting to see what this looks like in 50 years from now. Another big point is that violent storms over the last 20 years have caused all this runoff that have deposited mud and silt over the cliff faces that obscure. I have no idea how many images they might be obscuring. And rocks are still falling, which you can see what happens to rock art recorders when the rocks fall. They leave their stick behind and their hat. That's all that's left of them. But no, it's very active and potentially a very dangerous place. But what are our key takeaways here? It's that we have drastic landscape change over the last 1,600 years. And if we want to start understanding the ages of panels in areas like this, we also have to know how old the landforms are at the base of the panels to begin constructing a chronology. We can't just assume that everything is the same age. I think another important point is that even rock art research needs the help of geomorphologists and geologists, a little bit of dirt archaeology, techniques such as PXRF or whatnot, and a multidisciplinary approach to give us a broader view. And that when we start looking at rock art in relation to the landscape, I think it provides some very important clues. So let's go back here. We were, say, 2,000 years ago, the river was up here. And all those spectacular paintings, which would have been bright and vibrant then, are at eye level. You would have been walking right next to them. Here in this narrowest part of the red wall where the river cuts through. And we have the concentrations of the hand stencils, especially on the upstream and the downstream end. If you, and I have done this, if you start walking up the river from this direction, you have no clue that this little canyon is here. And you walk upstream and turn a corner, and all of a sudden you're in this gorgeous little red rock canyon, a whole new world. If you happen to be walking upstream and going down, all you are seeing is this humongous red wall. I'm wondering, how the heck am I going to get through this? So that, you know, the stand stencils are demarcating the passageway, and the associated paintings decorate the walls. Now, we'll never know the exact meaning why people put the hand stencils there, but I think that I think we can fairly safely say that they're delineating a very, very powerful space for people, and that there's also a huge association with bears. So then what happens post bow and arrow times? Erosion begins. Those hand stencils get stranded. They're up in the air. Not much is made in a little bit of rock art. Very little rock art is made during that period of time. And that circa 400 years ago, we start having a lot of upland deposition. And by that, I mean landslides and rock falls. I think some of those things happened really, really fast. The shield-bearing warriors get added and displaying their mythology, or the warriors are displaying the sources of their power and spiritual protection to anybody who happens to come down into that valley, maybe as a warning. We also have very important scenes of Absoluki mythology and whatnot, so that, you know, they might be saying, these warriors might be saying, you know, be careful if you decide to come in here, because this is our territory. Of course, we have the buffalo jump just right upstream a little ways. And then we have very little evidence of post-contact indigenous presence in the district, but it starts to give you a way of thinking about how views of the landscape may have changed over time. So with that, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And there's a ton of people that need to be thanked in here. Not to mention the Wold family, Marla and Peter, who were very gracious to allow us to work on their land. Amanda and Charles, I don't know what we would do without them. And these are many of the people who worked on the sites. And I don't have the names of all the field school students, but that's my story. So
Well, quite a
I hope that
story.
was clear as mud.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So we invite people to post some questions in the chat if you have something. Um, and maybe I'll start with a couple of questions. So you just talked about how you have both washing away of soil from the base of the cliffs as well as deposition.
Yep.
So is there the possibility that you have deposition above rock art panels?
Right in there, no, it's too steep. You know, I mean, like, it's where the rock, which is actually quite soft, is eroding in place, and which geologists refer to as residuum, and just simply you know, it's disintegrating and washing over the cliff. So it would be a little too old to have rock art on it, or burying rock art.
Okay.
I mean, I was just glad we were able to figure out how to get up to 4 meters above the ground surface, not 20.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine that this, the washing away and deposition would be, could have been alternating over thousands of years, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and, you know, honestly, you know, the Middle Fork started cutting that valley during the Ice Age. So it's been continually down cutting for millions of years. And it's only and you know, the high terraces that many people often see along river drainages that are covered with river gravels. Lots of times they're big gravels, you know, about like that, if not bigger. Those are all Pleistocene age river terraces, which the river used to be way up high. I'm going to say hi to Janet Lever. How are you?
Oh, yeah, okay. So you mentioned the buffalo jump that was in the
Mm-hmm.
vicinity. What was the age of that one again?
Very late post-contact or pre-contact, excuse
Late
me.
pre-contact,
So
right?
yeah, and not by much, but you know, it's Spencer's thought that that was very definitely associated with the crow.
Okay. Was there any rock art specifically directly related to the buffalo jump or not?
No, not directly. The Buffalo Jump is actually on a little bit different geologic formation, and it's a conglomerate of boulders or cobbles that have been
Oh, okay.
cemented together. So there was no rock art right adjacent to the jump.
Right. So it's not as if they didn't want to put it there, it just wasn't suitable. Uh,
That would be my assumption. Yeah. So
okay. We have a question. Do you know what the archaeological name for the time period of 400 Common Era is in that particular region?
it used to be called. It would be like, as I was referring to it tonight, very late pre-contact in between when there was actually Caucasian Euro-Americans in the area. So it also used to be more commonly referred to as the proto-historic, which we're trying to get away from using those terms that specifically reference Euro-American, yeah, everybody had history. We weren't, the Euro-Americans weren't the only one who had history. So,
Yeah, but 400 Common Era is still 1,000 years
oh,
earlier
wait,
than contact.
excuse me. I was getting my AD. So let me do some math here.
Yeah, 400 AD basically.
Yeah, 400 AD. So we'll use 2000. So that would be 1600 years ago. So that would be what's commonly referred to as late prehistoric, or it would be, that's about the time the bow and arrow was introduced. Very close in there.
Okay, so which side of archaic is it?
That would be the newer side of archaic. It would be what we used to is referred to as the late prehistoric period.
Okay, so yeah, maybe just go over the period. So you have an archaic period which basically goes back all the way to Paleo, and
Yeah,
and it's
Paleo to archaic. And the end of the archaic is generally marked as the transition from atlatl to bow and arrow technology. So, and generally considered to be about 2000 to 1500 years ago, roughly.
okay. So that's dated right in the middle there.
Yeah.
Is a question, is there a paper that you've written about this topic that we can read?
Yes, and it just got published in Plains Anthropologist, and it's online. If I were a more adept Zoom user, I could put the URL in the chat, but I don't trust myself to do that and not cut us all off. But it's Larry Lohendorf is the senior author on that one. And that literally just got posted online last week.
Okay, and what's the title if someone wants to do a search for it?
Oh, you would ask that. Let me look. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. Downloads. It's called the Wold Rock Art District, Wyoming, 48 JO 4515, Changing Landscapes and Estimating Ages of Rock Art. Let's see if I
Great.
can copy the URL. Let me try it. Let's see if I can.
Well, I think with that title, it should be easy enough to search.
Yeah. Ask AI assistant. Is that copy? Copy. Oh, now let's see. Let me go into the chat.
Why don't you just read it off if you can, because the chat isn't available to everybody watching.
Oh, okay. I was going to, can I do a meeting group chat? Yeah, the URL is way too long to read
Yeah.
off.
Okay. But yeah, they can quote, if you just quote the title as or part of that title, chances are you will find it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. I have another question about the cairns actually, because you showed early on in the presentation this small kind of flat rounded cairn, and I guess you described it as being native. But how do you tell if something like that is native or not?
You mean the rock cairns?
Yeah, early on.
Um, People have excavated around them and found, indigenous artifacts associated with them. Like if it were along a fence line in the middle of a plowed field, you might have assumed that it was the farmer who cleared all the rocks out of his field and piled them up. But these aren't along fence lines, so a lot of it is contextual.
Uh-huh. And okay, so were there offerings found? You mentioned offerings. Were they found in conjunction with the cairns?
Not specifically at those cairns, but in a lot of places, people just left rocks as offerings or to mark their way, or to say, I have been here. So the rock itself, as it's added to the pile and the pile grows over time, the rock itself becomes the offering.
Yeah, and you haven't been able to date any of those cairns one way or another?
I have a young man who was working for one of the consulting firms up there, I think had found some middle archaic, like perhaps as old as 4,000-year-old artifacts very close to the cairns. They're typically in places where a lot of times they're located on bedrock and not good places to dig.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned cairn line. So what makes a cairn line as opposed to just a cluster of cairns?
Well, they're in a linear arrangement.
Does it have to be
So
a straight line, or does it have, or can it
well,
be
it
a
can
curved line?
curve, but like the Bar C cairn line goes for miles, and you can just keep going from cairn to cairn to cairn to cairn.
Hmm. With how much distance between each one?
It's really variable. Sometimes they're visible from one to the other, and other ways you kind of go, well, let's walk over here, and then, oh, guess what? There's another cairn.
Hmm. So would that be a trail marker cairn?
Possibly, again, or it ends up serving as a trail marker. There's no shortage of landmarks by which to navigate out there, so I don't think people needed to find piles of rocks to get from point A to point B or to know where they were going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that they would have multiple different cairns as opposed to just adding your offering to the same cairn and having a big one.
Well, at different points along the way, maybe, it was a different time of day, something different happened. So
Yeah.
we'll or I want to make a new one.
Yeah. There's no ethnography that describes how they were used.
Not that I'm aware of, but you find these, there are cairn lines that all over that Larry has worked on and George Frizen worked on, literally going from one end of the Bighorn Basin to the other,
Hmm.
practically. So,
Wow, interesting. And none of them are like effigies in the sense of having a shape.
not that we've been able to observe. Now, we haven't done anything like really done, a super lot of detailed mapping, but most of the time they appear quite round. A drone would be handy for something like that. And who knows, maybe if we got high enough up with the drone, some of what appears to be a line could actually be something else.
Yeah. And I guess one last question on those. So how many stones would be typically in one of these cairns, or does it
Oh,
vary all over the place?
the larger ones, it could be hundreds.
And smaller ones?
Uh, 10 or 15.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat at the moment, so I think we can probably call it a wrap. But it's really been interesting looking at, working with the geography and the trying to get dates and landforms. I'm excited to see this kind of work. Hopefully, we'll see more examples of it. Uh,
Well, and Charles, in the talk he did about Grable South, we were looking at much the same thing with the stranded rock art there, and the importance of looking at the landscape around the site, and that is just as important as looking at the imagery itself. And those are the kinds of questions that interest me. So.
yeah. Do you have the chat open by any chance right now? Someone says
I
they.
do. I see that Mark Willis just said that he's done a lot of drone work on the cairns, and they seem to be long linear piles of rock.
Hmm. And you should have one other question. I think somebody said they sent the question directly to you.
They did. I see one from Evelyn. It says about the PXRF on the green pigment. There were hints of copper coming out in the PXRF. but not fully verified yet, but some idea that there was copper. The problem that Eric was having is that the paint was so thin and so faded that even with collecting a reference sample in a non-painted area, we're getting way too much of the signal from the underlying bedrock. And that was just the way it went.
Okay, and is there one from a Janet you can see there?
Oh, okay. I see 2 notes from Janet. Have I found something about measuring a hand? Are we talking about the handprints, Janet? 2 notes. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm not good enough on this to get 2 notes from Jan. Oh, what if I try clicking on it? That might be 2 notes. All I'm seeing is 2 notes from Janet. If you're wondering about how Maddie measured the hand dimensions, I think was Larry, you're on the chat, used some very precise measuring, maybe even like not LiDAR, but a pretty fancy instrument. It wasn't somebody out there with a tape measure. So, and part of her problem was, or not, I shouldn't say problem, was trying to obtain a comparable sample size to compare between, like modern anthropology graduate students might have different sized hands than indigenous people from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, lots of interesting things to think about when doing that kind of sampling.
But you did have a range of sizes which indicated
They did, yes.
different ages.
And Maddie did the measurements, and you would need to look at her master's thesis, which would be Madeline Mackey, and that would be the University of Wyoming Anthropology Department. So you could probably find that online.
Yeah, okay. And Amanda says that she used structure from motion 3D modeling. So she took measurements from.
Thank you, Amanda.
Okay, so unless you have any other ones addressed to you in the chat, I think that we're good on all the questions, and you definitely generated a lot of interest. We appreciate it very much. And thanks again, everybody else, for attending, and remind you that our next lecture will be on April 12th at 5:30 Pacific time with Mike Bees. So